And the way that I'm going to set this up is really quite simple. We're going to be doing 3 sections for today's stream, all right? In the first section, we're going to go over the focus of each style. That means what should be the focus when you're using it. Like what it's important about the style. What are the things that help you to decide which style to use? And so this kind of break down this focus part right here will help you to figure that part out. We're also going to go over the pros and cons. We're going to go over probably the explore page. We're going to go over the stamp catalogs and make some assessments about the different styles. And then we're also going to do the best use cases. That means which are the best ones to use. So do I make a dungeon or a castle with fantasy, or do I make a forest with the watercolor style? So we'll kind of go over the explore page and kind of see which style works best for which type of map that we're working on. So that will be kind of helpful. Let's go first over the focus of it. Hey, Hot George. Glad that you're here, by the way. Thanks for waving. Appreciate you being here. So, fantasy versus watercolor. The focus of the fantasy battle map style is more realism. When you look at the map here, you notice that the stamps have way more detail. They have baked in shadows on the rocks, on the stamps themselves. The focus is more on realism and immersion. Right? So fantasy battle maps are designed to create environments that feel physical and believable. The style focuses on building environments using stamps. That means whether it's going to be lines, shapes, lighting, and layered terrain to create depth. So the more realistic style, the battle map style, is great for adding lights, shadows, creating a sense of depth, more immersion. It's definitely more rooted to make your map look more realistic. Not necessarily realistic, but more realistic. The converse is true for the watercolor battle map style. It's much more simple and much more stylized. The watercolor battle maps are intentionally simple and stylized on purpose. This gives the map like a clean, artistic look that emphasizes readability and style over realism. In other words, the kind of takeaway from it is less is more. Because the style is simple, the maps also should be simple. It's so, in other words, the fantasy battle map style is all about depth, detail, lots and lots of clutter. It's messy. And while the watercolor battle map style is more about simplicity, and you don't have to overthink when you're putting together your map, you don't have to add all these lights and shadows. You can, but I find that what often happens is that when people try to make a watercolor battle map, they try to treat it the same way as the fantasy battle map style because they want to add all these lights and shadows. And I understand that the fantasy battle map style came before the watercolor battle map style. So obviously a lot of people have been used to using the fantasy battle map style, and that makes the change over to watercolor battle maps a little bit more difficult because you can't treat the watercolor battle map style the same way that you treat the fantasy battle map style. One, it has a different focus than the other. If you try to make a fantasy battle map with the watercolor battle map style, then you're going to notice that it's going to look a little weird, right? It's going to clash. You're trying to add all this depth and lighting and shadows to it, and it ends up clashing, and it doesn't really look that good. So simplicity is key when you're thinking about using the watercolor battle map style. At least I have discovered that. So again, immersion and realism for fantasy battle maps, simple and stylized for the watercolor battle map style. Let's go over the pros and cons. So, and some of the pros and cons are really apparent. For those who use both styles, you'll find out that they really kind of stick out. So the pros for the fantasy battle map style is it's highly detailed, realistic assets. We were talking about how realism and immersion is a part of the style. There's also a huge stamp asset library. There is so many. If we go into the catalog here, and then we go into fantasy battle maps, you'll notice that there is a ton of battle map assets. So many. The list goes on and on. There are so many that you can go through, right? The style is older, so it's been more developed, and it has a lot more assets. And a lot of the assets are being updated to 2.0. So look forward to that. So a lot of the new art's going to be updated. So it's going to be even more realistic once we finish with it. So you'll see there's a lot of assets with a lot of different detail and whatnot. So Fantasy Battle Maps, quite a massive catalog. It's also excellent for tactical combat clarity, great for interiors and environments. It's kind of converse watercolor battle maps because there's so much more assets. Interior environments are so much better and easier to create with fantasy battle maps because of how much stamps that you have that you can work with for interiors. It also, there's a lot of lighting and shadows. There's built-in light. You can use shapes and lines for shadows. So it's very heavy in that way. And it works well with like lots of dense clutter. You can stamp spam and it won't look too bad. Well, conversely, with the watercolor battle map, stamp spamming can look really odd, especially because of just how thick the line work is when you look at it in the catalog. Let's go over the pros for the watercolor battle map style. It's clean, it's simple, has a visual style. There's fast terrain painting workflow, excellent natural landscape stuff. I use it all the time for making maybe like a little ruin or making some type of region, but I very rarely use it to make interiors, though you can. Obviously, the art is available to you, but there is less access to interior stamps, unlike the fantasy battle map style. So I kind of find that a lot of the maps, when I look on the explore page, which we'll go over, I've noticed that a lot of them are exteriors. They're not interiors, and it's because of that lack of assets for interior stamps there. It's also very readable in counter spaces. I've kind of noticed that when you work with the style, because it's watercolor, I try not to do a lot of stamp spamming. And when I do less stamp spamming, I create more of this positive space versus the negative space. And with the fantasy battle map style, it's much more forgiving about that. But with watercolor, it's not so much. So again, the thing just to remember when you're using the two is that don't treat them exactly the same. There is a difference between the two. Let's go over the cons of both real quick. It can become visually cluttered. I've noticed that sometimes some of the maps I make, I'll stamp spam a lot, and that becomes very visually cluttered. I think it can work, but I think sometimes it can be a little over the top, especially if you're stamp spamming. Because there's much more quality in the art, a lot more stamps, and you're adding a lot more details, lights, and shadows, that can be drain on the system, on your machine. So it's probably a little bit heavier on performance, while watercolor battle maps is a little bit more forgiving. The terrain blending can be harder sometimes, just because of the variety, and there's all these artifacts that are in the catalog, the art catalog textures. And so sometimes it can be difficult to blend them. That's gotten easier now with the new brushes, and we'll kind of go over some of the brushes when we go into some of the more live demo stuff. But I think, and then overall, because you are adding more depth, lighting, shadows, and all that stuff, it definitely takes longer. I would say that when I'm working on a watercolor battle map, it only takes half the time than it would be if I'm working on a fantasy battle map. I've just kind of noticed that because as you're adding shadows and all this depth, it takes up time. And so that kind of brings this point that one of the great things about watercolor battle maps is because it's simple, you can make a battle map very, very quickly. While working with fantasy battle maps, it can actually take a little bit longer because of all the details. And of course, you don't have to add all the extra details. I think a map looks a little bit better when you put more effort into it, more time. But I think it's a little bit more forgiving with watercolor battle maps where you can put in a minimal amount of time and still come out with a visually appeasing or visually appealing map, even if you're not adding all these extra details like you would with fantasy battle maps. It's all about trying to keep it simple, right? The more complex you try to make a watercolor battle map, I think it kind of ruins the map a little bit because you're trying to treat it like it's fantasy battle maps. Watercolor battle maps is different. It's a different style, and your approach should be different as well. Let's go into like some of the cons with watercolor battle maps. There's a smaller asset library, which is very frustrating for users because when you're used to the fantasy battle map style, which of course it's more established, it's been here longer, there's obviously not a ratio 1-to-1 where you have the same amount of stamps. You might have something in Fantasy Battle Maps that you don't have in Watercolor Battle Maps. Now, this, of course, is frustrating, but at the same time, it does present a challenge for you as a creator because it allows you to try to be, or forces you to be more creative because you're trying to do more with less. So in that way, sometimes watercolor battle maps can be more challenging because of that lack of assets, but that challenge can make you an overall better artist because you're learning to do more with less. That's a big one with the watercolor battle map style. There is less environmental detail, and that's because, again, there's not as much detail in the textures. The textures are very simplified. There's some great artifacts that are in a lot of the watercolor battle maps styles, but they're not as detailed as you would find with the fantasy battle map style. And again, these are not necessarily the most ideal for super dense encounters. I prefer more open spaces when I'm working with watercolor battle maps, but that's not a rule or anything. That's just what I kind of find that works best. Super cluttered, heavy spaces. Sometimes the fantasy battle map or fantasy watercolor style doesn't really work, or the watercolor battle map style doesn't really work all that well for that. But again, you can do whatever you want with either style, but the takeaways I have is just I try to treat them differently from each other. Don't try to treat watercolor battle maps like fantasy battle map style. It doesn't work that great. So best use cases, and this is just from me, the way that I kind of came about these observations was going over the explore page and then kind of just scrolling through the explore page and looking through over maps to see how much there was. And I also looked in the search field and then looked up different types of maps as well. So what we'll do is we'll look up some of these in the explore page and I'll kind of show you how I went over those. But let's go close out of here real quick, and then we'll go over to the explore page here. And we're going to go into, let's go over to choose a style. We're going to go watercolor battle maps. So one thing that I've kind of noticed, remember I mentioned that interiors are not, there's not quite as many interiors as there is exteriors for watercolor battle maps. Let me type in tavern real quick right here like this, and you'll notice there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 taverns in total with the style. But then when I switch the style over to fantasy battle maps, you'll notice that the tavern starts to load quite a bit more. So as you can see, there's quite a bit more interior assets. Obviously, the style is older and more established, as mentioned earlier, but there's just so much more options. So I've noticed that interiors generally work best for the fantasy battle map style, while conversely, watercolor battle maps, I don't see quite as many. It doesn't mean that you can't make them. It just means there's less available assets for interiors. And again, if you're a new user, you might shy away from that. That's understandable. If you're a power user, then you might want to look at that as a challenge, right? Again, you're trying to work with less, and that requires more, a better understanding of negative and positive space placement, trying to figure out how to do overall composition. It's a bit harder when you have less assets to work with. So watercolor battle maps is for those of you who might want to challenge yourself. So I kind of find that helpful. I've also noticed that the exteriors, like if you have an outside, I've noticed that there is a lot more with watercolor battle maps. I got a question here. Mark Call. Is there plans to expand stamps for either option other than updating the current ones? I'm not sure about watercolor. Probably I haven't seen that, but that doesn't mean that we can't if there's a higher demand for it. I personally am way for adding more stamps to watercolor battle maps. The watercolor battle maps, again, is like much more stylized. So I would think of it as a more niche. And I think that's just normal with how the way the human eye works. The humans prefer what realism is something that you can be more immersed. Was more immersion when it looks more realistic. So I can see why people would gravitate towards fantasy battle maps more. But watercolor battle maps is like, it's far more stylized. It's more niche. And so it appeals really to what your players like. Do they prefer a more immersive experience, or do they prefer to have a more stylized map that's easy to read? So I personally use fantasy battle maps a lot more than I use watercolor, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use them, because I find that if you use both, it kind of challenges you a little bit. And what I'll often do is I'll make a watercolor battle map, and then I will go ahead and then I'll turn that into a fantasy battle map. I'll clone it, and then I'll open it up, and then I'll start using the replace asset feature, and then I'll start replacing assets, replacing the lines and everything. The thing is, when you do make whenever you're trying to make a map across styles, try to use as much as the line and the shape tools as possible, because this way it's easier for you to change the stroke of and the texture for the fill. That way it's easier to convert from a watercolor battle map, or vice versa, fantasy battle map over to watercolor. And again, no style is actually better than the other one. It's just personal preference. I see why a lot of people would prefer the fantasy battle map style because of the immersion, and there's just so much more access to the art. But I would personally love to see more watercolor battle map art. That would be fantastic, because I think a lot of the maps are pretty cool and stuff. Let's go over to watercolor battle maps real quick. I'm gonna get rid of the tavern thing, and we can kind of go over just a couple of the watercolor battle maps, because I wanted to mention just what I mean by kind of keeping it simple. Those ones kind of do the best. Let's go over to most cloned, and you'll see that most cloned ones, besides the fact that they're older, obviously, but the ones that are the most cloned and the most liked are the most simple, right? They're not complex. They're functional. They're easy to create. Like, this probably wasn't super complex. It has plenty of open spaces. It doesn't have a lot of stamps, but it's visually appealing and it works, right? It has a lot of these open spaces. Remember, I mentioned watercolor battle maps generally work better when there's more open spaces and not so much clutter. So you could see why this map does so well outside of its age, right? Kind of same thing with this one here. There's a lot more stamps going on here, and there is a lot more shadows. I think there is more of an attempt to make this look more in the fantasy battle map style, but I think it works here. The overall arrangement, the colors, filters that were used to bring everything together, especially the wonderful contrasts with the bright wall and the darker ground there. This works great, but it's still not super complex, right? So I think when you're working with the watercolor battle map style, if you keep things simple like the art, then I think it yields a better result. While conversely, with fantasy battle maps, you can add as many details, lighting, shadows, and stamps as you want, and it will still look pretty good. So I think fantasy battle maps generally works probably a little bit better for new users. It may seem intimidating because there's a lot of art in the catalog, but because watercolor battle maps has less, it's probably a little bit more challenging. So I would definitely encourage you to definitely try to make more watercolor battle maps. And even though it doesn't look as quite as visually appealing, obviously because of the immersion of the fantasy battle map style, but it does challenge you quite a bit. I've been making a lot more watercolor battle maps lately, and I always struggle with using it because I'm used to finding every asset that I need, and then when I don't find an asset that I need, then I have to start getting creative. It really starts to stretch my imagination, and to try to use assets in different ways, try not to repeat the same asset over again. Do I need to make changes, the hue, the brightness, the darkness, the contrasts? I have to make some changes. So I think, again, watercolor battle map style, more challenging, but at the same time, you can get a map done so much quicker. Yeah. Oh, you like how the big maps of continents look in Inkarnate? I do too. I totally agree with you, first time chatter. Absolutely. So many great maps on the explore page that are continents. Love the world map style, parchment world style. Two great styles. Definitely go use them. Let's keep going over a couple more too. This one's made by one of our team members, Philip. Great map. Absolutely love this one. It's so simple. It's kind of a two-tonal map. You have just blue lighting with the more brownish color, so kind of a neutral brown with a cool blue. It's just basically two tones, or two colors really, and then the different tones of those colors, and it's simple, right? That's what makes this map so appealing. Simple lighting and shadowing, simple, lots of open spaces, Not a lot of deep, super deep contrasts like you see with the fantasy battle map style. And that's the appeal of watercolor battle maps. So great map. Really enjoyed that one. I'll kind of go over. Like you'll see here that we have another one from Philip. It's an interior. What makes this one so good is just there's tons of that open space. I know I harp on this on a lot of my streams that contrast is king. One of the big contrasts for any art medium that you're using is positive and negative space. When I say negative space, I mean space where it's just texture, and then positive space is wherever you place stamps. So you'll notice there's a lot of open, positive, or negative space here to work with, and that contrasts with the closed space, or that positive space, which is covered with stamps. So all this open space really, really works well. And even though there's a lot of shadowing here and there's lighting here, it's not over the top. It's not too contrast. It's not too dark to where it pops out. And because if you look at any watercolor painting, you'll notice that it's very light. There's not a lot of super darks to super brights. There's not a lot of contrast when it comes to brights and darks in watercolor pieces. Maybe I'm mistaken. I don't do a lot of watercolor painting, but the ones that I've seen, the ones I've enjoyed, they're generally a little bit on the lighter side. And so that same concept carries over. Think of if you're used to using watercolors, you notice that you use mostly water. It's not oil or acrylic, so it's not very thick. It doesn't create very dark darks and very bright brights. It doesn't really do that. So that same concept, you should do that when you're working with watercolor battle maps. Try not to do heavy light and dark contrasts. Try to keep things light, try to keep things simple, and then the style is much more approachable that way. Because so often what I see users do is they try to take a fantasy battle map, they're so used to that style, and then they try to make a fantasy style battle map with the watercolor battle map style, and it really just doesn't settle with them correctly. The approach is simplicity when it comes to watercolor battle maps. Always remember that, so that when you're working with it, it won't be nearly as complex. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'll go over a couple more that I find are really good ones here, and then we'll go over fantasy battle maps, and then we'll also look up the same thing. So I'll look up like a forest ruin in fantasy battle maps, and then I'll look up a forest ruin in watercolor battle maps, and we'll see the difference here. This one right here is a really, really good one. I really like this one. Notice again, not heavy contrasts. There is a darker green here and a lighter green, but it's not super dark. Well, actually, I do see some fantasy battle map stamps in here. Not a very good example here. Let's go over a couple more here, find some good ones. I particularly like this one quite a bit. This one's good. It's super simple. I like this one. This one's cool. Let's keep over a couple more. Here's like another interior right here. This one, there is a lot of attempt to make this more fantasy battle maps. I feel, in my opinion, when you try to add in a lot of shadows and lighting, I actually prefer mine to be just a little bit flatter. I think that's just the way that I prefer to do it. I try not to put heavy shadows in mine. It doesn't mean that it can't look good. It doesn't mean that it's the right or wrong way. But I do find that trying to add a lot of lights and shadows does begin to make the map more complex. It tries to create depth, and forcing depth on a watercolor battle map, in my opinion, is pushing it a little too far. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It does look good if you do it right. I can show you a trick that I use that actually another user showed me. You can use the night filter, then use a layer mask, and then you can simply just paint in your shadows with a night filter. And the reason why that works is because the night filter has this bluish color to it. It's not black. Black is very dark, and so it creates contrast against the lighter stamps in the set. So, but if you use a night filter and a layer mask, the shadows are more of a bluish color, making them a little bit lighter, especially a little bit lighter. And then therefore you can brush in shadows without creating this heavy dark contrast like you do with the fantasy battle map style. So again, just try to stick with the more simplistic style. If you want to add shadows and lighting, try to minimalize and use the night filter for your shadows, so that way you're not using those thick dark ones. Would you be able to do a demo on that, or a different? Oh yeah, you want me to do a demo? Absolutely. Let's Let me check the time real quick. 27? Yes, we'll absolutely do a demo. I'll find a watercolor battle map. In fact, I have one, and I'll clone and edit it, and I'll show it. We'll show you that, okay? That's a great idea. Let's go over. I'm gonna look up. Well, real quick, we'll look up a map in both styles. I'm gonna look for Forest Ruin. Here, let's make sure we have the right style. Let's go with Fantasy Battlemaps. So here's kind of your Forest Ruin. There's less of them because it's the exact title that I typed in, so you might not have that. But you can see here, see all the heavy shadows, the dark, heavy shadows in these maps. Let me go over them. Some shadows here. You'll see, look at this one here, some heavy shadows trying to get those stamps to pop out. Same thing here, you've got some heavy shadows here. So a lot of shadow work. But then when I switch over to Forest Ruin with the watercolor battle map style, we'll let that pop up real quick. Give it a minute to load. Yeah, it was a great idea, Trent, by the way, for mentioning. Nope, I'm not so sure. Will it find it? Let's refresh the page real quick. Let's go back to watercolor battle maps. We'll type in Forest Ruin. And if it doesn't have a Forest Ruin, then we can probably just type in Ruin. There we go. And you'll notice it's quite different, right? It's much more brighter. There's some attempts to make darker shadows here in one of mine, but I tried to make it fantasy battle maps. But watercolor, I feel like it just does so much better when you don't have a lot of heavy contrasts in it. But it's okay if you do it. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it. Okay, let's go. I'm going to open up a watercolor battle map, and I'll show you one in which I did that trick. This one right here. We're going to go ahead and view the map. I'm going to go ahead and clone it. We're going to do it Ultra 4K. We're going to open it up, and I'll show you how I did this, because this is actually a really cool trick. I want to give credit to Alice Pendragon for coming up with the technique. So I learned that from them. So I'm appreciative to them. But I think the technique works. They use it a lot on fantasy battle maps because I don't see them use watercolor battle maps a lot. But I have seen that this technique works really, really well with watercolor. So we'll let this load up, and then I'll kind of go over and show you how I did it. Because sometimes if you want to add light and shadows to your watercolor battle maps, you can. And I think that flat works fine. You don't have to add shadows. I try to be minimal about it. Just going to give this a minute to load. Thanks for waiting. I appreciate it. Once this opens up, we'll go over it. Thanks for waiting. Appreciate it. Is it wanting to load here? Yeah, okay. It's just going slow. There we go. Okay. So if you notice on this map, I'll go ahead and turn the grid off so that's easier to see here. There you go. You notice this blue, this heavy blue right here? That's actually the night filter itself. So you notice right here, night filter. Right? If I go ahead and turn it off, notice the shadows. Look at this. So let me go ahead and turn it on and off so you can see it. There it is without shadows. It looks flat. It still looks fine to me. I think it's perfectly readable. Flat is fine. It doesn't make it look any better or worse. But then if you want to add depth to it, then I add this night filter to it. And the approach that I go to doing this is pretty simple here. I'll go ahead and remove this night filter right here. I'm just going to go to delete. Remove it all. There we go. Pretty easy stuff. And then what I'll do here is I'm going to go create a clip terrain here. Let's go with terrain. I'm going to add a new filter right here. I'm going to put filter layer. We're going to add the night filter. So here's that night filter right there. Okay. One thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to bring the opacity down just a hair. Let's go with right about, let's say about 50 or so, right? 50% or so. Yeah, you think it's witchcraft? Terrorwin? Yeah, it's a great trick. All big shout out to Alice for coming up with it. Great idea. Absolutely love using it. But this is pretty cool stuff. You'll like this stuff. So what I'll end up doing here first is once you, let me real quick here. Where is our filter layer? This looks good. Let's go ahead and add a mask layer. I'm going to go to fill. Oopsie, go to black here, go to fill. This will remove all of it, right? But if I switch back over to white, I'll be able to apply the mask. You see that? Now, what I'll end up doing is I'll change my brush up to this round, hard edge brush because I want my shadows to be hard, have a hard edge. You do not have to add a hard edge. It could be a soft edge. Really, it would just depend on how far the light source is. The closer the light source is, the harder the shadow edge is. The further away the light source is, the softer the edges of the shadows are. So let me just go ahead and paint this. Now, there's something I want to mention. You do want to make sure that the night filter is above whatever you want to paint your shadows on. So notice that my night filter is above my terrain filter. So now when I go to paint in my shadows, I want to create this shadow right here. I can, and now I have this nice shadow that I'm painting in right here like this. I'm going to add in this nice, good shadow here. Put it along here like this. Add a little bit of shadow. Maybe I want to add a little bit more here, just to add a little bit more depth there. I just want to show that there's more of a cliff here, right? So I'll go ahead and add a little bit along this edge. And I am using a pen, just to let you know, but you don't have to use a pen. You can use a mouse. Just find a pen to be a bit easier. And what I'll do is I'll just paint in wherever my light source is. I'm going to have my light source coming from the left side. So I'll paint my shadows on the right side, because the light is coming from the left side. So I'll go ahead and add those shadows. And now the trick about the shadows is if you want this cliff to be if you want this section right here to be really tall, then you would paint a very long, elongated shadow, right? To show that it is higher up. If you wanted to show that it was only slightly higher up, then you would put the shadow like that. So the trick to height with shadows is the greater the shadow, the higher up it is, right? So just kind of keep that in mind here. So I'll go ahead and put this up like this. We'll paint in those shadows. And you're right, it does make a huge difference when you add in shadows. It's not a necessity. It's not necessary that you have to add shadows to them. But if you do, I find that the night filter works the best for this, because that light blue doesn't super contrast hard against like a super black. It would look much different if I tried to use a black color. I find that this bluish color that the night filter does works so much better. So just kind of a heads up, definitely use that night filter trick so that you can create those subtle shadows that aren't going to be overwhelming, that kind of happens when you try to add shadows with the watercolor battle map style. Because that black color, oopsie, I made a mistake there. That black color there just looks so weird. And I'll show you what I mean. I'll paint in a black shadow in a segment so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Let me go ahead and add another one. Some people sometimes like to paint their shadows on. Let me go ahead and turn off the night filter here. Let me just take a step back so you can see. So here it is with those shadows. It makes quite a difference, doesn't it? Right? I take that off. It seems flat. I turn them on. No longer does it look flat. It looks like it's popping out more. So definitely use the night filter trick with the layer mask for making your shadows if you prefer to have shadows for your watercolor battle maps. They do quite well. And the other thing I would mention when you do that is don't forget to also, if you're going to add any stamp shadows, make sure it's that same bluish color of the shadows that you use with the night filter. Notice here that I've got this blue shadow right here. I set that blue shadow so that it would be coherent with, or try to mimic the same color that the shadows are in. So that's kind of important. If you do want to have cast shadows with the object shadows, remember to have it be blue and not black. So let me actually show you what I mean by that too. Let's go over here. We'll change this stamp right here. We'll change that shadow to hard black like this. It'll bring the intensity up and you can see the difference. It really adds this deep kind of contrast with a deep black. And when I kind of find that the blue works more in spirit and with practicality of the style, right? It's watercolor battle maps. Watercolors are light. Even when you use black on a watercolor, because of the water, it dilutes much of the black. It makes it slightly lighter than just pure black. The way that you would make it more darker with watercolor is by adding less water. But it's watercolor. You're supposed to use water. So when you're doing your shadows, to stay with the watercolor, with the overall style, use a lighter shadow colors. Light blue works really, really well. You can even use other colors as well. The shadows do not have to be blue. You can remember it is a stylized style. It's heavily stylized, so you can get away with a lot more with watercolor battle maps than you possibly could with fantasy battle maps, because fantasy battle maps ties you into a sense of realism, right? You can't be super artistically you don't have a lot of artistic license with it because of that. Because if you try to be super artistic with it, then it starts to break the immersion and it breaks up the more realism that the style invokes. But when you work with watercolor battle maps, you can be way more stylistic. I could change this shadow. If let's say that I was maybe in an autumn, let's say it was autumn, and I wanted to have my shadows be a little bit more on the reddish side, then I can go in like this. I can actually make him orange, actually would be a good color. Let's try that. Let's go over to shadow. Oopsie, make sure I got to select the right thing here. There we go. It's selected. Good. Let's go to shadow here. I'm thinking watercolor, so I don't want to use pure red. When I'm choosing my shadows and my colors, I want to dilute, I'm going to add more water or desaturate it a little bit more. Let's go into orange a little bit here. I don't want it to be perfectly orange color. I don't want to go all the way to here where it's super saturated. I want to bring it down here like this more orangish color here. And this shadow might work a little bit better if you had maybe a dead tree with some brown shadows or orangish shadows, because the overall map has more browns and reds in it. This map has blue because of the water in it. So I chose blue. The night filter works best because there's a lot of heavy blues in the map with the blue water, and the blue, because it's not super saturated and you can still see underneath it, it works well. So you can choose your colors wisely and you can be way more artistic about it, because this style gives you more artistic freedom and leeway. Well, fantasy battle maps is not nearly as forgiving. You can't go outside of the box nearly as much. You can, but I think watercolor battle maps is much more forgiving. Are you using layer shadows or custom or a mix? When it comes to the shadows, I am using a night filter right here. That's all I'm using, Typher, is just the night. Yeah, it's a lot of cool stuff that you can make with it, right? Super cool. I absolutely love this technique. Definitely use watercolor battle maps. Definitely use the night filter. It's super helpful. I do want to mention some other filters too that go really well with it. You can also use a faded one, because sometimes when I make a watercolor battle map, it looks a little too rich. Like, you look how super saturated the map is. It's really, really super saturated. And remember, watercolor is more diluted. It's more faded because of water. So sometimes what I'll do to give it that more faded paper, more faded look is I'll use a faded filter. What the faded filter does is it tries to remove some of the saturation in the map. And that actually works out well, because that's the spirit of the watercolor battle map style. It's the same thing when you're actually making a watercolor picture. Or watercolor painting, it's far more faded. When I do my shadows with the stamps, it's a great question, Typher. With these ones, notice that I have these bushes underneath these trees right here. That shadow would not be possible with a layer shadow. If I go over to layer shadow, let me click this thing right here. If I click layer shadow right here, that tree, layer shadow, it disappears, because layer shadows they share a universal global global shadow. So they won't stack on top of each other. But if you switch it over to custom object shadow, it will be able to stack on top of other objects. I use object layer shadows for very specific things. I very rarely use it for everything. I generally prefer object shadows because shadows will stack on top of each other. So that's why you're seeing this shadow be on top of all of these stamps. While if it was with the object layer, that would not be possible for that to happen. So for me to create a little bit more sense of depth, because I was using shadows here, I use that object shadow. I hope that answers your question okay. Yeah, so pretty cool. You can do pretty interesting stuff with it. Object shadows are fantastic. Or you can use them in fantasy battle maps. You can use them in watercolor. I think they work well. I think a lot of people always generally prefer to have a little bit of shadows on their map. I think it's okay to have them be flat. It's okay. It just depends. All right. Well, I think, did everyone understand exactly how to use the night filter? Is there any other questions that people had? I just want to make sure. Let me know in that chat. And then we'll also go over, we'll quickly, where are we at for time? 42. We'll go over a fantasy battle map real quick as well. And we'll go over probably brand new ones. Let me kind of go over that. I'm not going to save this. This map is available too for cloning if you want to use it. You totally can. Let's go into choose what fantasy battle maps real quick. And I'm just going to go with recent. Are there any intention to add orc stamps into watercolors? That I'm aware of, no, but that would be absolutely fabulous. That would be great. I would absolutely love that. Let's kind of go over the most liked ones. Unfortunately, most liked might not work well because the older maps generally have more likes to them. And what I really want to do is go over, I don't want to go ones on the explore page because I wanted to go over maps that are relatively like brand new, but they're not super. Wonder where I can go to find that. It's not in my feed. I'm trying to figure out. I don't remember where to go with it. Sounds like a feature request. I would upvote. Absolutely. I agree, Becca, there. I would love to see more. I think the problem that we have right now that I've noticed with watercolor battle maps is because people aren't making as many, and that's mostly due to just the asset library size and obviously the complexity issue. The transfer, like people trying to treat watercolor battle maps like it's fantasy battle maps. I think those two things are what turn people off to the style, the lack of assets, and just trying to use the watercolor battle map style in a different way. Use it the way that it was probably more intended to be used, though I wouldn't say intended. I don't want to like limit anyone's freedom. Yeah, oh, that's a good one. I can only make watercolors because it gives a top-down view. I'm terrible at perspective. Yeah, perspective is really hard. We'll definitely be going over in the future, in future streams, how to make like more isometric or not purely top-down, more like RPG top-down map design. We'll go over that in the future. I don't think it's coming up next month. All the streams have been scheduled for next month, but I definitely want to go over how people can use the fantasy regional style to make functional battle maps, because perspective is really difficult and people like perspective because, again, the human eye is kind of trained for perspective. Fantasy battle maps are purely like orthographic top down, like bird's eye view, and so we don't normally see things like that. So when we look at a regional map, obviously it's more visually appealing because it has more than one dimension to it. And we'll definitely go over into a stream on how to make battle maps with the fantasy regional style, because perspective is hard. You have to factor in more dimensions instead of just one dimension with battle map styles. Totally understandable. I don't feel. Here's a good one. Here, we remade this one here in a stream here. This is what someone else made here, and we just updated it in a stream, which turned out really well. All right, well, I don't think I need to go into battle maps because I think most people use them. I think you guys understood the general idea. I just want to mention the overall takeaway from them. Remember that watercolor battle maps, or let's go over here we'll go back to this to quickly review before we call it good. Just kind of remember this major important takeaway when you're deciding what maps you want to make. If you want something that's more realistic, it's more immersive, your players are much more into a more realistic encounter than something a little bit more stylized, fantasy battle maps is the style that you want to use. And it is a little bit easier to use because every stamp has a lot of depth and detail and shadows already added into it. You can plop down a couple stamps. So it's a bit easier to use, especially with more stamps. Watercolor battle maps, even though it's simpler, it is a little bit more challenging because it's just the lack of access to more stamps and the overall simplicity of it, and the transfer over from fantasy battle maps where the desire to want to add all these extra details and shadows and lighting. So, but I would definitely encourage you to go and try to make watercolor battle maps. My recommendation would be don't use any shadows and lighting at first. Just practice on using all the stamps in their defaults, or turn off the shadows if there's any defaults, and start to work from there. And then once you've kind of got the general idea on how watercolor battle maps work, then you can start adding your shadows if you want them. Use that night filter trick that I learned from Alice Pendragon. Works great. I would start with one thing at a time. Practice just making the map, and then you can go into details and lighting later, because you can learn a lot from using the watercolor battle map style, I feel, even though it's not nearly as popular and has nearly as much assets, though I wish it would. And I'm way down with people requesting more. I'm hoping we can get a landslide, an avalanche of requests for the style, because I think it deserves a lot more love. You can make a lot of cool stuff with it. It's a beautiful style. Matthias did a good job working on it, so mad props to them. Oh, that's cool that you prefer Trent more, that you prefer the watercolor more. Yeah, watercolor's charm is its simplicity. 100%. I totally agree with you, Terowin. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. We can also we very rarely ever do streams with watercolor battle maps, and I think that might be a good idea to do that. I think that's also another reason is most of our streams use fantasy battle maps for our battle map styles. If we make more, if we do more streams with watercolor, then it will probably attract more people to the style. So we'll definitely try to do at least maybe one stream a month where we actually use watercolor battle maps and kind of how to properly use it. So I think that would be more fun. All right, well, hey, I'm going to call it good. I hope you guys have some fun plans for the weekend. I know I do. The weather is going to be nice, so hopefully it's the same where you're from and where you are, and you can go out and enjoy that. So hopefully you got the times off. Plans for Orc? None that I know of, but we want to do that. It was mentioned earlier, and I agree, Zoppo. I hope that we get that. Definitely there is a request I see there. Go check that out. All right, everyone. Thanks a lot. Please stay safe and healthy. Merry map making, and I'll see you all next week, okay? Enjoy your weekend.